They did not lower Genevieve Harper into the Moonwell because they feared what she had done. They lowered her because they feared what would happen if someone finally remembered her name. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in courage and destiny, hit like and subscribe. These stories remind us, love finds the broken. Now, back to Genevieve. The full moon hung over Silverpine like a silent witness, washing the ancient stone circle in pale silver light, while hundreds of wolves stood shoulder to shoulder around the sacred spring that had blessed generations before them. Tonight, no songs rose into the night. No children laughed between the trees. Every voice had been swallowed by the weight of ritual. At the center of the circle, Genevieve stood with her wrists bound by braided silver cords that glimmered softly against her pale skin. At 22, she looked impossibly fragile in her plain gray dress, her chestnut hair tangled by the evening wind, and her blue-gray eyes shining not with anger, but with quiet disbelief. She searched the faces surrounding her, hoping to find one person willing to meet her gaze. One person willing to remember the countless fevers she had soothed, the frightened pups she had comforted, the lonely elders she had visited when no one else cared. Instead, every familiar face turned away. "Forgotten Omega," someone whispered. The words spread through the crowd like frost creeping across a frozen window. Forgotten Omega. The title settled onto her shoulders more heavily than the ropes around her wrists. It was easier for them to erase kindness than admit they had failed to value it. High Priestess Marceline Voss stepped toward the Moonwell, her ceremonial robes flowing behind her like shadows drifting across fresh snow. Her voice carried with practiced certainty as she raised an ancient silver staff toward the shimmering water. "The sacred spring remembers every truth," she declared. "Tonight it will receive what the moon no longer claims." The crowd bowed their heads in reverence. Genevieve did not. She simply stared into the perfectly still water, where the moon's reflection looked so clear that it seemed another world waited beneath its surface. She had visited the Moonwell only once as a little girl, holding her mother's hand before illness had stolen the only person who had ever made her feel seen. Back then, the water had felt warm, gentle, alive. Tonight it looked impossibly cold. Near the edge of the gathering, Alpha Alden Mercer folded his arms across his chest, avoiding Genevieve's eyes as though silence could erase responsibility. Beside him stood his elegant younger sister, Celeste Mercer, her expression composed, almost sympathetic, yet the faint curve at the corner of her lips never quite disappeared. Genevieve noticed it, but she no longer possessed the strength to question why. Somewhere behind the crowd, a child's trembling voice broke through the silence. "Please," she helped me. 12-year-old Miles Whitcomb tried to squeeze between the adults surrounding him, tears streaking across his face. Before he reached the stone circle, a guard caught his shoulder and gently but firmly pulled him back. His small hand stretched toward Genevieve anyway. She answered with the faintest smile she could manage, hoping to comfort him one last time. Even now, with fear tightening around her heart, she could not bear to let a frightened child think he was alone. Above the gathering, a cold wind swept through the pines, carrying with it the distant howl of a wolf unlike any the pack had ever heard. The sound rolled across the mountains with ancient authority before fading into the night. Several elders exchanged uneasy glances. Marceline paused for only a heartbeat before continuing the rite. Far beyond Silverpine, a lone rider reined in a massive black horse upon a moonlit ridge. King Dorian Blackwell lifted his head as his silver eyes fixed on the northern sky, his wolf suddenly restless beneath his calm exterior. He had never set foot in Silverpine for this ceremony, yet something inside him tightened with inexplicable urgency, as though an invisible thread had been pulled taut across the wilderness. Back at the Moonwell, Genevieve took one slow breath as the priests guided her toward the ancient water. She did not cry. She did not beg. But deep beneath the moonlit surface, something unseen stirred before a single ripple spread quietly across the sacred spring, as if the Moonwell itself had awakened just moments before the ceremony truly began. The first touch of the sacred water against Genevieve's shoes should have felt like winter, yet it carried a strange warmth that sent an almost forgotten memory racing through her heart. She closed her eyes for the briefest moment, and instead of hearing the frightened murmurs surrounding the Moonwell, she heard laughter from years before, when she had still believed kindness could earn a place within a pack. Long before anyone called her the Forgotten Omega, Genevieve had lived in a tiny cottage at the edge of Silverpine beside her widowed mother, Eleanor Harper, whose gentle hands had taught her that strength was measured by compassion rather than dominance. After Eleanor's death, the little cottage remained, but every season seemed to steal another piece of Genevieve's place in the world. While the young alphas trained with spears and celebrated their growing power, Genevieve quietly gathered herbs from the forest, mended torn blankets for elderly wolves, and spent long evenings sitting beside feverish children until their breathing eased. She never expected gratitude. Seeing relief soften another person's face had always been enough. Yet kindness rarely attracted admiration inside a pack obsessed with strength. It became invisible. When crops failed after a harsh winter and livestock sickened without explanation, frightened whispers spread faster than reason. Someone claimed the moon goddess must have withdrawn her blessing. Someone else insisted an unlucky Omega was drawing misfortune upon Silverpine. The rumors drifted through the village like poisonous smoke until they settled, almost effortlessly, upon Genevieve. Alden Mercer heard every accusation. As Alpha, he could have silenced them with a single command. Instead, he chose silence because fear united frightened wolves more easily than truth. Every day he delayed, the lies became harder to challenge. Celeste Mercer understood that better than anyone. Beautiful, graceful, and admired throughout the territory, she knew exactly how to plant suspicion without ever appearing cruel. A concerned glance, a carefully chosen question, a whispered observation that Genevieve always seemed to appear wherever misfortune followed. She never directly accused her. She simply allowed frightened imaginations to finish the story. Even so, Genevieve continued helping anyone who knocked on her door. One rainy afternoon, 12-year-old Miles Whitcomb stumbled into the woods chasing a frightened fox and slipped down a rocky embankment. By the time Genevieve found him, his ankle had swollen badly and terror had replaced every trace of courage. She carried him nearly 2 miles through the rain despite her own exhausted body, wrapped his injured leg with strips torn from her only good shawl, and stayed beside him until his grandmother, Alara Whitcomb, arrived. The elderly woman had squeezed Genevieve's hands with tears in her eyes. "The moon sees what people forget," she whispered quietly. Genevieve had smiled without understanding the weight behind those words. Miles never forgot. Neither did Alara. But gratitude from 2 lonely souls could not compete with the voices of an entire pack searching desperately for someone to blame. Weeks later, several ceremonial lanterns surrounding the Moonwell were discovered extinguished before dawn. Marceline Voss called it an omen. Celeste quietly mentioned seeing Genevieve walking home from gathering herbs near the sacred grove that evening. No one asked why Genevieve always chose the forest path or whether anyone else had traveled it. The story already fit the fear growing inside every heart. By the time Genevieve was summoned before the council, the verdict seemed written long before she spoke. She answered every accusation with calm honesty, but honesty sounded painfully small beside certainty. Even Alden could barely meet her eyes when the council declared the Moonwell itself would judge whether she remained worthy of Silverpine. Genevieve returned home that evening carrying only a basket of dried herbs she would never use. Inside the cottage, untouched tea still rested beside her mother's faded chair, while moonlight spilled across the worn wooden floor as though nothing had changed. She packed no belongings because there was nowhere left to go. As dawn approached, someone slipped a folded scrap of parchment beneath her door without knocking. There was no signature, only 6 hurried words written in trembling ink. "Do not trust the sacred judgment tomorrow." Genevieve folded the unsigned note and tucked it beneath the ribbon around her wrist, carrying those 6 hurried words like the last fragile ember of hope into the gathering that would decide her fate. Dawn had barely broken when the guards escorted her from the little cottage to the Moonwell, where the stone circle had already filled with villagers dressed in ceremonial white. No one threw stones. No one shouted insults. Their silence was somehow crueler. It was the silence of people who had convinced themselves that mercy and justice were no longer the same thing. Marceline Voss stood beside the sacred spring with her silver staff planted firmly against the ancient stones, while Alden Mercer occupied the place reserved for the Alpha of Silverpine. His shoulders remained straight, but his eyes lingered on the ground whenever Genevieve looked toward him. She realized then that guilt could make a man appear just as lonely as the person he condemned. "Step forward," Marceline commanded. Genevieve obeyed without resistance. The silver cords around her wrists had been replaced by ceremonial chains woven with moonstone beads, light enough not to wound her skin, but heavy enough to remind everyone that she no longer belonged among them. The high priestess lifted a polished bowl, scooped water from the Moonwell, and let it fall slowly through her fingers. "This spring has judged kings and commoners for centuries," she proclaimed. "If the moon still claims this woman, the water will reject our sentence. If not, the sacred depths will receive her." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Genevieve remembered the warning hidden beneath her door. "Do not trust the sacred judgment tomorrow." She searched the faces once more, wondering who had risked everything to send it. Alara Whitcomb stood near the back with Miles at her side. The elderly woman's expression held neither fear nor certainty, only quiet sorrow. When their eyes met, Alara gave the slightest shake of her head, almost too subtle to notice. Genevieve understood only that someone believed this ceremony had already been decided. Marceline raised both hands toward the pale morning sky. Ancient words echoed across the clearing, their rhythm older than memory itself. As the chant grew stronger, the surface of the Moonwell brightened until it resembled polished glass reflecting the moon that had already faded from the heavens. The water should have rippled beneath the rising wind. Instead, it became unnaturally still. "Bring her forward," Marceline ordered. Two guards guided Genevieve to the stone ledge surrounding the spring. She could smell fresh rain lingering on the moss-covered rocks, and hear Miles struggling against the adults holding him back. "She saved me," the boy cried, his voice cracking with desperation. "She never hurt anyone." Several villagers lowered their eyes, but no one stepped aside to let him through. Alden closed his eyes for a single heartbeat before giving an almost invisible nod. The guards obeyed the order he never spoke aloud. Genevieve looked at the Alpha one final time. "I forgive you," she said quietly. The words struck him harder than any accusation could have. His jaw tightened, yet he remained motionless. For the first time since Eleanor Harper's death, Genevieve felt completely alone. The guards released her hands. For one suspended breath, she stood at the edge of the ancient spring, staring into water so clear she could see no bottom beneath its silver glow. Then gentle hands became firm hands. A single push against her shoulders sent her falling backward into the Moonwell. The crowd gasped as the sacred water swallowed her without a splash. Instead of crashing into icy depths, Genevieve felt herself drifting through warm silence, as though invisible arms were carrying rather than drowning her. Above, the surface hardened into shimmering crystal, sealing the opening with radiant light. Miles screamed her name. Alara fell to her knees. Even Marceline stared in stunned silence as faint lines of golden light spread beneath the transparent water like living veins awakening after centuries of sleep. Far beyond Silverpine, King Dorian Blackwell pulled sharply on his horse's reins as a powerful ache tore through his chest without warning. His wolf surged beneath his skin with a force he had never experienced before, urging him toward a place he had never intended to visit. He turned his horse north without another thought, unaware that somewhere beneath sacred water, a forgotten Omega had just opened her eyes instead of closing them. King Dorian Blackwell reached Silverpine shortly before sunset, expecting nothing more than to investigate unsettling rumors surrounding the ancient Moonwell. Yet from the moment his horse crossed the outer boundary of the village, an unfamiliar unease settled deep within his chest. He had led warriors into battle, judged disputes between rival packs, and stood before enemies who wished him dead without ever doubting his instincts. This feeling was different. It carried no threat, only an impossible sense of absence, as though someone who should have been there had quietly disappeared. Rowan Hale noticed the king's silence long before either of them spoke. "The ceremony ended this morning," he said carefully as they rode through the village. The high priestess declared that the Moonwell accepted its judgment. Dorian gave a slight nod, but offered no reply. He told himself the strange pressure in his chest was nothing more than exhaustion from days of hard travel. Even so, the feeling refused to fade. Instead, it grew stronger with every step toward the sacred grove, until his wolf became unusually restless beneath his calm expression. By the time they reached the Moonwell, the clearing stood empty except for a handful of elders preparing evening offerings. The ancient spring appeared exactly as every royal chronicle had described, perfectly still, crystal clear, untouched by wind despite the towering pines swaying all around it. Dorian remained motionless at its edge for several long moments. Reason told him he was staring at nothing more than sacred water. His instincts insisted someone was staring back. He closed his eyes briefly, trying to silence the growing conflict inside him. No king could govern a realm by chasing feelings alone. Every judgment demanded evidence. Every decision carried consequences for thousands who trusted the crown. Yet the harder he tried to dismiss the sensation, the more unmistakable it became. His wolf did not sense death beneath the Moonwell. It sensed life. Slowly, Dorian knelt beside the ancient stones. He extended one gloved hand toward the flawless surface, but stopped just before his fingertips touched the water. At that exact instant, a single ripple spread outward from the center of the Moonwell. There was no wind, no falling leaf, no visible cause. Rowan's voice broke the silence behind him. "Your Majesty, did you see that?" Before Dorian could answer, Marceline Voss approached with measured steps, silver ceremonial staff resting lightly in her hand. "Residual sacred energy," she said calmly. "The Moonwell often behaves strangely after judgment." Her explanation sounded practiced, almost rehearsed. Dorian studied her expression instead of the water. She appeared composed, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the staff when his gaze returned to the spring. She was not afraid of the Moonwell. She was afraid of what he might discover. As twilight deepened, Dorian looked once more into the crystal water. For the briefest heartbeat, he thought he saw a faint golden glow far below the surface. It vanished before he could be certain it had ever existed. Reason urged him to dismiss it as reflected light. His instincts refused. That night, Silverpine prepared a royal banquet in his honor, yet every conversation faded into distant noise. Dorian found himself glancing repeatedly toward the dark forest beyond the windows where the Moonwell rested unseen. The same invisible pull remained, quiet but unwavering, asking a question no evidence could yet answer. Long after the feast had ended, he left the manor alone and returned beneath the moonlit pines. This time, there were no priests, no elders, no witnesses, only the ancient spring and the silence surrounding it. He stood at the water's edge until the moon reflected perfectly across its surface. Then, without warning, a voice as soft as a fading breath reached him, not through his ears, but somewhere far deeper. "Please, don't forget me." Dorian's eyes widened. The pressure inside his chest disappeared as suddenly as it had begun, replaced by absolute certainty that someone still lived beneath the sacred water. He had no proof. He had no explanation. But as he looked into the Moonwell one final time, he understood that leaving Silverpine without uncovering the truth would haunt him far longer than questioning any sacred law ever could. The whisper refused to leave Dorian Blackwell's mind. It followed him through the stone corridors of Silverpine Manor, lingered beneath every formal conversation, and echoed inside every heartbeat until the coming dawn brought him no peace. Throughout 15 years upon the Obsidian throne, he had ignored rumors, trusted evidence, and never once allowed instinct alone to guide the fate of his kingdom. Yet this time, his wolf would not obey reason. It returned again and again to the same certainty. Someone beneath the Moonwell was alive. Before sunrise, Dorian walked alone to the sacred spring. Mist drifted above the flawless surface, wrapping the ancient stones in pale silver silence. He stopped at the edge, staring into water that reflected the fading moon so perfectly it looked untouched by the world. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. The question disappeared into the stillness. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, deep below the crystal surface, a faint pulse of golden light answered before vanishing again. Dorian felt his chest tighten. It was not proof. It was not enough to justify defying centuries of sacred law. Yet it was enough to make walking away impossible. "Your Majesty." Alara Whitcomb approached, carrying an old lantern whose warm glow barely reached the water. "I prayed you would come before the council convinced you to leave." Dorian turned toward her. "Tell me what everyone else refuses to say." Alara looked at the Moonwell for a long time before speaking. "The oldest records were hidden long before I was born. What survived exists only in fragments. But every fragment says the same thing. She rested one trembling hand upon the weathered stones surrounding the spring. The Moonwell was never created to bury the guilty. It was created to shelter those the moon chose until the one worthy of claiming them arrived. Dorian frowned. Then why has it become a place of judgment? Because fear rewrites history more easily than truth. Her answer settled heavily between them. Before he could ask another question, Rowan Hale and Caleb Frost arrived in haste. Rowan's usually composed face betrayed unusual concern. "The council is waiting," he said. "Victor Crane insists your investigation ends today." Minutes later, the council chamber filled with uneasy silence. Victor Crane stood beside Marceline Voss while elders from Silverpine watched the Alpha King carefully. Victor bowed with practiced respect. "Your Majesty," rumors spread quickly. "They say you question the sacred judgment." Marceline stepped forward before Dorian replied. "Our ancestors left one command above all others. Once the sacred water accepts its guardian, no ruler, priest, or alpha may break its sanctuary." Dorian caught the unusual wording. "Guardian." Marceline hesitated for the first time. Only a heartbeat, but long enough for him to notice. She corrected herself immediately. "Prisoner." Dorian remembered Alara's words. "Shelter." "Guardian." Someone had changed the language. Victor continued smoothly. "If the sacred water is disturbed, no one knows what follows. Crops may fail. Rivers may dry. The moon's blessing may leave every pack under your protection. Will you risk thousands of innocent lives for one Omega condemned by her own people?" The chamber fell completely silent. Rowan looked toward his king with quiet conflict written across his face. Later, when they stood alone beneath the palace balcony overlooking Silverpine, Rowan finally spoke without titles or ceremony. "If you are wrong, history will remember you as the king who destroyed his own realm." Dorian rested both hands against the cold stone railing. "And if I'm right?" Rowan had no answer. The silence between them became answer enough. Dorian closed his eyes, hearing Genevieve's fragile voice once more. "Please, don't forget me." He imagined the faces of every child, elder, and family across the northern territories who depended upon his judgment. He had sworn to protect them all. But what kind of king protected his people by abandoning one innocent soul because tradition demanded it? When he finally opened his eyes, the uncertainty remained, but fear no longer ruled it. "A law that survives only because no one dares question it," he said quietly, "is not faith. It is fear wearing faith's face." Before dawn broke completely, he issued his first irreversible command. "Seal the Moonwell. No priest, elder, or council member approaches it without my permission. I will not leave Silverpine until I learn whether our ancestors built a prison or a sanctuary." Far below the ancient spring, Genevieve pressed her trembling hand against the radiant barrier once again. This time, instead of cold stone, she felt the unmistakable warmth of another hand answering hers through the sacred water. Neither of them knew how such a bond could exist, but in that silent touch, both their destinies crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The invisible bond between them grew stronger with every passing hour. Beneath the crystal-clear sacred water, Genevieve Harper no longer measured time by sunrise or darkness, only by the quiet warmth that answered whenever she reached toward the glowing barrier above her. She still did not know whose presence waited beyond the Moonwell, yet the unseen connection reminded her that somewhere above, someone had chosen not to forget her. Before dawn, Elara Whitcomb led King Dorian Blackwell and Rowan Hale into a forgotten archive hidden beneath Silverpine's oldest shrine. Dust drifted through narrow shafts of lantern light as they searched weathered shelves untouched for generations. At last, Elara carefully unfolded a faded manuscript wrapped inside worn blue linen. Most of its writing had disappeared with time, but one passage remained remarkably clear. Rowan quietly read the ancient words aloud. "The sanctuary shall remain sealed until 3 vows become one. The guardian must be found innocent. The crown must freely offer its blood. The hand that breaks the sacred water must choose mercy above power." Dorian lowered the manuscript slowly. "These were never laws," he said. "They were conditions." Elara nodded. "The sanctuary does not obey power. It answers only when all 3 vows are fulfilled together. She pointed toward another damaged line barely visible beneath the faded ink. One truth survived. Her finger rested upon the surviving words. The sanctuary never accepts the guilty. If its chains begin to release, the moon has already judged the guardian innocent. Silence filled the chamber. No one needed to say Genevieve's name aloud. They all understood what the ancient record meant. Before another word could be spoken, hurried footsteps echoed through the passage. Caleb Frost appeared at the entrance, breathing heavily. "Your Majesty," he said. "Victor Crane has gathered the council, the priests, and nearly the entire village at the Moonwell. They intend to perform what they call the final sealing before anyone begins questioning the judgment." Dorian immediately folded the manuscript and followed Caleb toward the sacred grove. By the time they arrived, hundreds of frightened villagers had surrounded the Moonwell. Marceline Voss stood before the sacred water with her silver staff raised while Victor addressed the gathering with unwavering confidence. "The king's hesitation dishonors our ancestors," he declared. "If the sanctuary is not sealed forever today, every tragedy that follows will fall upon this kingdom." Fear spread quickly through the crowd. Parents pulled children closer. Elders lowered their heads in silent prayer. Caleb quietly positioned the royal guard between the priests and the Moonwell. No swords left their scabbards, yet every soldier understood that one reckless order could divide the northern territories before sunset. Rowan stepped beside Dorian. "If violence begins here," he warned quietly, "we may lose far more than one village." Dorian looked beyond the priests to the frightened faces watching from behind them. None of those people believed they were choosing cruelty. They believed they were protecting those they loved. That realization weighed more heavily than any crown he had ever worn. Without another word, he walked alone until he stood at the very edge of the Moonwell. "No one approaches the sanctuary," he said calmly. Victor answered immediately. "And if the moon demands obedience instead of mercy?" Dorian never looked away from the crystal water. "Then let the moon judge me instead." Before anyone could speak again, gentle ripples spread across the perfectly still surface. Golden light slowly blossomed beneath the sacred water until Genevieve became clearly visible below, her blue-gray eyes fixed upon the king. Then, before every witness, the silver moonstone chains around her wrists fractured with soft, unmistakable cracks. One, then another. Tears filled Alara's eyes as she stepped toward the ancient spring. "The first vow has already been fulfilled," she whispered. "The moon has remembered its guardian." Dorian instinctively looked at the healing wound across his palm. Only 2 vows remained. For the first time, he understood that saving one forgotten Omega would demand more than courage. Before another sunrise, he would have to choose whether mercy was worth risking everything the crown had sworn to protect. No one moved. The sacred grove stood frozen beneath the pale moonlight as King Dorian Blackwell slowly closed his fingers around the ceremonial blade resting at his side. The first vow had already been fulfilled. The moon had remembered its guardian. The second now depended entirely upon him. The third remained hidden beyond certainty. For the first time since ascending the obsidian throne, Dorian understood that mercy demanded greater courage than any battlefield ever had. He drew one slow breath and stepped toward the Moonwell. Behind him, Marceline Voss's voice no longer carried the confidence of a high priestess. It trembled with fear. "Your Majesty, once the sacred water is broken, nothing will ever return to what it was." Dorian did not answer. His silver eyes remained fixed upon Genevieve Harper beneath the crystal-clear water. She looked back at him through the radiant barrier, not pleading to be saved, but quietly hoping she had not been forgotten. In that single heartbeat, the throne, the council, and every sacred law faded into silence. Only one lonely woman remained. The woman who had answered cruelty with kindness until kindness itself had finally found its way back to her. Slowly, Dorian turned the ceremonial blade inward and reopened the healing wound across his own palm. Fresh, crimson blood flowed onto the ancient stone before slipping into the glowing fractures spreading across the sacred water. For one endless heartbeat, the valley remained still. Victor Crane smiled with growing confidence. The moon rejects him. But beneath the crystal surface, Genevieve witnessed something no one else could see. The golden currents surrounding her immediately rushed toward Dorian's blood before stopping at the final moonstone chain encircling her wrist. The sanctuary had accepted the crown's sacrifice. Only one vow remained unfinished. Agony suddenly surged through the invisible bond linking them. Dorian staggered forward as though struck from within. Beneath the water, Genevieve felt the same pain echo through her own heart. Looking down at the final chain, she finally understood what had imprisoned her all along. It had never been forged from moonstone alone. It had been strengthened by every year she had believed the lies whispered about her. Every lonely season she accepted that she deserved to be forgotten. No king could break that prison for her. Only she could. She closed her eyes and remembered the last lesson her mother had ever given her. Love is never born from fear. Slowly, Genevieve released the fear she had carried for so many years. She no longer believed she was the woman others had accused her of being. She believed the truth she had lived every day, with every child she had comforted, every elder she had cared for, every act of kindness no one had chosen to remember. The moonstone chain cracked beneath her fingertips. Then it shattered like thin ice beneath the first warmth of spring. At that very instant, the golden current surged freely toward Dorian's blood. The sanctuary had recognized that all three vows had become one. Dorian stepped forward without hesitation, not as an alpha king claiming authority, but as a man freely choosing compassion over fear. He pressed his blood-stained palm against the radiant sacred water. The Moonwell answered. A deep crystalline song rolled across the valley as the ancient barrier dissolved into countless streams of silver and gold spiraling peacefully toward the heavens. No curse descended. No darkness emerged. The sanctuary had simply fulfilled the promise it had guarded for generations. Genevieve drifted upward through the fading light, but exhaustion claimed her before she reached the surface. Her body fell still. Genevieve. Dorian plunged into the glowing water without hesitation and caught her before she slipped back into the depths. For one terrible heartbeat, she did not breathe. Every wolf surrounding the Moonwell stood motionless, unable to look away. Then a quiet breath escaped her lips. Her blue-gray eyes slowly opened, and the first face she saw was not the Alpha King who had defied ancient law, but the man who had refused to forget her when an entire kingdom had turned away. Around them, the restored Moonwell became as clear as polished glass. Images rippled across its surface for every witness to see. Celeste Mercer scattering black ash around the sacred lanterns beneath cover of darkness. Victor Crane carefully feeding frightened elders the lies that transformed fear into certainty. And Marceline Voss silently allowing the oldest records of the sanctuary to disappear behind locked stone walls while rewritten histories replaced them. Gasps swept across the gathering. Alden Mercer lowered his head beneath the unbearable weight of his own silence. Caleb Frost quietly signaled the royal guard, who stepped forward to arrest Victor before another lie could leave his lips. Marceline released her silver staff, allowing it to fall against the ancient stones without resistance. Yet Genevieve looked at none of them. She rested one trembling hand against Dorian's chest, smiling faintly as she felt the calm heartbeat that had crossed every boundary of fear to reach her. Above the sacred grove, the clouds slowly parted, bathing the restored Moonwell in warm moonlight. Tears shimmered in Alara Whitcomb's eyes as she whispered, "The sanctuary has fulfilled its promise." And every wolf standing beside the ancient spring finally understood that the greatest miracle had never been the breaking of the sacred water. It was the courage of two souls who chose compassion over fear, forever changing not only the fate of one forgotten Omega, but the heart of an entire kingdom. The silence that followed the breaking of the sacred water felt almost sacred itself. No curse descended from the heavens. No darkness swept across the valley. Instead, the trembling beneath the ancient stones slowly faded until only the quiet sound of flowing water remained, gentle and unhurried, as though the Moonwell had finally remembered the purpose it had guarded for centuries. Dorian Blackwell held Genevieve Harper until he felt the steady rhythm of her breathing return. Only then did he carefully help her to her feet. For a brief moment, she leaned against him, still weakened by everything she had endured. When she found her balance, Dorian quietly stepped back without a word, giving her the space she had been denied for so many years. The choice of where to walk next belonged to her alone. Genevieve drew a slow, unsteady breath. Cool mountain air filled her lungs for the first time in what felt like another lifetime. She closed her eyes as the scent of pine, damp earth, and wild lavender drifted gently on the morning breeze. Warm sunlight settled across her face where cold water had once surrounded her. Slowly, she knelt beside the ancient stones and brushed trembling fingertips across a patch of soft green moss. It bent beneath her touch before gently rising again. A quiet smile, fragile but genuine, appeared through her tears. She was no longer beneath the water. She was beneath the open sky. Around the sacred grove, no one dared disturb the silence. Wolves who had once stood in judgment now lowered their eyes, unable to meet hers. The truth reflected by the restored Moonwell had stripped away every excuse they had hidden behind tradition. Alden Mercer stepped forward first. Without ceremony, he removed the alpha crest from his cloak and placed it upon the broken stone beside the spring. Then he knelt. "I remained silent because silence protected me," he admitted quietly. "It did not protect you." Genevieve looked at him for a long moment. Nothing could return the years she had lost. Nothing could erase the loneliness he had allowed to grow. Yet she also saw a man no longer hiding behind pride. She reached out and gently helped him rise. "Then don't be silent when someone else stands alone," she said softly. "That is where forgiveness begins." Alden lowered his head, understanding that redemption would be earned by the choices still ahead, not by apologies spoken too late. Nearby, Caleb Frost quietly escorted Victor Crane away in chains while the Royal Guard dismantled the barriers surrounding the Moonwell. No cheers rose from the gathered wolves. Justice did not need celebration. It needed truth. Marceline Voss remained beside the shattered spring, her silver staff resting heavily in her hands. Alara Whitcomb approached and gently covered those trembling hands with her own. Neither woman spoke. Some burdens could only be answered through quiet humility. Suddenly, small footsteps echoed across the clearing. "Genevieve." Miles Whitcomb ran toward her and wrapped both arms around her waist. This time she laughed softly through tears as she embraced him without hesitation, holding him close beneath the warm morning sun. Watching them from a respectful distance, Dorian smiled quietly. He understood that this moment did not belong to a king. It belonged to the woman whose kindness had survived every act of cruelty meant to erase it. As villagers slowly removed the warning ropes surrounding the Moonwell, several looked toward the broken stone where the sacred water had opened. Dorian turned to Alara with a silent question in his eyes. She smiled gently. "No," she whispered before he could speak. "The sanctuary has fulfilled its promise. Let the scar remain, so every generation remembers what fear almost destroyed and what compassion restored." A little later, Dorian walked toward Genevieve and simply extended his hand. He offered no command, no promise, and no prophecy. Genevieve looked at him, then at the open path leading away from the Moonwell. After a quiet moment, she chose to place her hand in his. No ancient magic bound them together now. The bond that remained belonged only to two hearts that had freely chosen mercy over fear. Side by side, they walked away from the restored Moonwell toward the forest path, carrying no destiny except the one they would build together with every step that followed. Winter settled gently over the northern territories, covering the forests of silverpine with fresh snow and softening the scars that fear had carved into both stone and memory. Yet one place never surrendered to the cold. The ancient Moonwell continued to shimmer beneath the moon with a warm golden light, instead of the pale silver glow remembered for generations. Travelers often paused beside its waters without understanding why the air there felt strangely peaceful, as though the valley itself had finally been allowed to breathe again. In the months that followed, King Dorian Blackwell fulfilled every promise born from the day the sacred water was broken. Before the assembled alphas of the Northern Territories, he signed a new covenant declaring that no wolf would ever again be judged by ritual alone. Every accusation would require truth. Every sentence would require evidence. Every life, alpha, beta, or omega, would stand equal before the law. The forgotten records recovered by Alara Whitcomb were carefully copied and carried to every pack, restoring the Moonwell to its true place in history, not as a prison of judgment, but as a sanctuary of protection. Marceline Voss quietly surrendered her office and remained beside the ancient spring, devoting the rest of her years to preserving the truths she had once allowed fear to bury. Alden Mercer returned to Silver Pine without ceremony. Rather than asking for forgiveness, he rebuilt the small cottage where Genevieve Harper had once lived alone. Its weathered walls became a refuge for orphaned children, weary travelers, elderly wolves, and healers with nowhere else to serve. Above the doorway, Miles Whitcomb carefully carved a simple wooden sign with his own hands. No one is forgotten here. When Genevieve returned the following spring, laughter echoed through the little cottage that had once known only silence. Children ran through the herb garden she had planted years before, while Miles proudly showed her fresh lavender and healing herbs growing where loneliness had once taken root. Genevieve knelt beside the garden and gently brushed her fingertips across the fragrant blossoms. Warm earth crumbled softly beneath her touch. She smiled, realizing she no longer needed to prove that kindness mattered. It had already taken root in the lives of others. Later that evening, she and Dorian walked together to the Moonwell. No guards followed them. No priests waited nearby. No ceremony remained unfinished. The broken stone where the sacred water had opened still rested quietly beside the ancient spring, untouched by royal command. Dorian glanced toward it before asking, "They still offer to rebuild it. Should we let them?" Genevieve rested her hand upon the weathered stone for a long moment before gently shaking her head. "No," she answered. "Some scars should remain, not to remind us of pain, but to remind us what compassion was willing to heal." Dorian smiled softly. Without another word, he reached for her hand. This time there was no prophecy joining them, no invisible bond, no ancient magic asking either of them to choose. Only two hearts, finally free to choose one another. Together they turned away from the Moonwell and followed the narrow forest path beneath the golden evening sky. Behind them, the sacred water grew perfectly still, its oldest promise finally fulfilled. Seasons would continue to change. Kingdoms would one day welcome new rulers. But the choice made beside the Moonwell would remain. Long after they disappeared among the pines, a little girl paused beside the ancient spring while walking hand in hand with her grandmother. Looking curiously toward the quiet water, she asked, "Grandmother, is this where they imprisoned the forgotten Omega?" The old woman smiled, her eyes following the distant figures of Genevieve and Dorian until the forest slowly embraced them. Then she gently squeezed the little girl's hand. "No, child," she said softly. "This is where everyone finally remembered Genevieve Harper." The little girl looked once more toward the peaceful Moonwell, then toward the forest path where the couple had disappeared. She did not imagine a forgotten Omega. She imagined a healer, a woman whose quiet courage proved stronger than fear, a woman whose kindness changed not only her own destiny, but the heart of an entire kingdom. The Moonwell reflected the last golden light of sunset before becoming perfectly calm once more, as if it had been waiting through countless generations for this single story to end exactly as it always should have, with fear remembered only as a lesson, and kindness remembered forever in the name of Genevieve Harper.